Welcome back to the channel. I'm Jon Kelly, here to talk UFC Vegas 53 betting and Draftkings picks. Let's get into it. Up first, we have UFC newcomer Tatsuro Tyra going up against Carlos Candelario. Tyra, the big favorite at minus 250. The comeback on Candelario is plus 200. And this one is an interesting matchup because both guys are relatively green. Tyra obviously coming in with a lot of hype. He's a 10-0 prospect. 8 of his wins have come inside the distance. And really, when you watch his fights, yes, they came against lower level competition, but he does have at least some tools we can get excited about. He's got some good back takes. His striking is not great. He's very low volume, super patient on the feet, probably too patient. But when he does let his strikes go, he sits on his strikes quite a bit, like especially those leg kicks. He looks to attack the legs of his opponents, but he is really throwing everything into those strikes. So when he does throw, we know he's throwing with power. And then in terms of Candelario, you know, he fought on Dana White Contender Series. Came in on short notice, fought Victor Altamirano in what was a very close split decision. A lot of people thought he might have won that fight. Decent account for himself, but he's a guy that I just don't think is really all that good in any area. Like he's pretty solid, should have a striking advantage here, probably the better wrestler, but I do think he could be potentially in danger on the mat with Tyra, who I think is the better submission grappler in this matchup. For that reason, I don't really have a strong take. I do think the line is probably a little bit wide here, but I actually do favor the upside of Tyra, especially in terms of DraftKings, because I just think the ceiling is much higher. The problem is the price, because he's such a sizable favorite. He really needs that early first or second round finish to pay off his tag. So there are definitely some questions here. I'm going to have exposure to both sides because I am treating Candelario as a live underdog in this spot. I'm just not sure how much I want to get exposure to this fight. So I'll have some of both sides, probably heavier on the underdog, but no bet for me on the first fight of the night. Up next, we have Gina Mazzani going up against Shayna Young. Gina Mazzani comes in as a minus 165 favorite. The comeback on Shayna Young is plus 145. And I bet Gina Mazzani early in this week. I bet her at minus 152. It's obviously moved a little bit since then. This is going to be my biggest play of the week. I bet her for 2.5 units at minus 152. And the reason I'm so confident in Gina Mazzani, I know some people might be a little bit sketched out, laying that much, laying any sort of juice with Gina Mazzani. And I get it, right? Like, she hasn't had the best run in the UFC, and she's also shown some really sketchy moments. You know, she gassed out hard against Priscilla Cachoeira. She's been finished multiple times at the UFC level, but I really do not rate Shayna Young high whatsoever. Like, I do not rate her skill set highly whatsoever. I think Shayna Young has awkward striking. You know, she's going to throw a little bit of leg kicks. She's a lot of times off balance in terms of the striking, and her grappling is just not there. Like, she's physically built well. You know, she looks like she's super jacked and whatever, but she can't defend takedowns. She defends around 50%. She was taken down multiple times by Sarah Alpar on Dana White Contender Series a couple seasons ago. She was finished by Sarah Alpar, and for those that don't know, Sarah Alpar was basically one of the worst to do it in the UFC. So that was obviously not a good look. She fought once since then over in Invicta before coming back, taking a short notice fight against Macy Chiasson. That's what got her into the UFC. She got dominated by Chiasson, taken down multiple times in that fight as well. And then her last fight against Stephanie Egger, a bunch of people were pumping her up. Yo, Shayna Young, the Shanimal, she's jacked. She's got the striking. And I bet Stephanie Egger's there. It was one of my stronger takes on that card. Eggers completely dominated her, took her down, ended up getting the TKO stoppage in the second round. So this is a spot where I just think Shayna Young, maybe, I don't even know if she has a striking advantage here. And even in the perfect world where she can keep it on the feet, which I don't think she will, I still kind of think she probably loses that fight, and I really just don't see the fight playing out that way. Gina Mazzani averages just under 5 takedowns per 15 minutes. You know, she's going to come in and wrestle here, and that's part of the reason why she gassed out in a couple of her recent fights, was because she had that nonstop wrestling pace. She's not going to get much opposition from Shayna Young on the mat. I think Mazzani takes her down here multiple times. I think she controls her and even potentially finds a finish. I know the over 2.5 is minus 175, but I don't mind sprinkling a Mazzani by sub. I'm waiting to see what FanDuel releases those odds at. I'm already big on Mazzani on the money line. If you got in early, great. great. I think anything under minus 200 is probably still worth a 1-unit play, but I'm waiting to see what Mazzani by sub is. If we get like a plus 750 or something on FanDuel, I'm probably going to hit that as well. I like Mazzani here. I think she does it by multiple takedowns and potentially a finish on the mat. So I feel pretty good about this spot, and hopefully she gets it done for us on Saturday. Next fight up, we have another former Dana White Contender Series fighter, Natan Levy, coming in as a sizable favorite at minus 220. The comeback on Mike Breeden is plus 180. And this is a matchup where I definitely favor the Levy side. I just think the grappling edge is relatively big in favor of Natan Levy here. I just think Breeden is not really, he doesn't have much of a skill set outside of being just a power puncher, right? Like 8 of his 10 wins have come by knockout. A lot of those have come early. We know he can punch hard, but when he doesn't get those early finishes and he's forced to grapple or forced out of the first round, he just really doesn't have the skill set, in my opinion. So I think Natan Levy probably has even a technical striking advantage here. He has a black belt in Kung Fu, a black belt in Karate. He's just low volume. So I do have concerns if the fight does get stuck on the feet here. That's where I'm kind of worried that Levy maybe doesn't do enough, but I do expect him to mix in the takedowns where he should be able to control Breeden on the mat and potentially find a finish. So I feel like this is a card where I'm hoping we see a lot of submissions. I think we will. I definitely hope we will, because I'm probably going to be betting a couple submission props this week. So I think Levy by submission is the official pick on this fight. And in terms of DraftKings, I think both guys have upside. Levy obviously has the grappling upside in a win, but Breeden, I mentioned that if he has one thing, it's power. I know he trains out of Glory MMA with James Krause. Maybe we see some improvements on the other aspects of his game, but until I can see that myself, I'm going with Levy here. Up next, we have Gabe Green, comes in as minus 145 favorite. The comeback on another Dana White Contender Series debutant fighter, fought on last season of Dana White Contender Series, is Johan Lines. He fought in October, won by first round knockout, and that's basically the story of his career. He's an 8-0 prospect. Level of competition is pretty suspect, but again, he does have some power. So I favor Gabe Green in basically almost every area outside of pure power. It's just the fact that Green does tend to get reckless at times, especially in the striking. He could be a little bit lazy, and Johan Lines does carry some real power, especially early in the fight. So I wouldn't be completely shocked to see him just like meme KO Green early, but outside of that, Green's cardio and his grappling, which I don't rate super highly, but Lines really tends to struggle in the grappling. I think Green has him covered there. I believe Green is a brown belt. I could be wrong on that. Don't fact check me, or someone fact check me on that. I think he's a brown belt. Either way, I don't think he's like this super great grappler, but I don't think he needs to be against the level of Johan Lines here. So I like Gabe Green. I think especially outside of the first round, it really starts to favor him. The cardio dynamic really starts to swing in his favor. So I like Gabe Green here. I think he's the rightful favorite, and I just think he has multiple paths to covering that number, right? Because if this fight gets extended and the cardio really favors him, then I could see him start to take over in rounds 2 and round 3. But also outside of the cardio dynamic, if he chooses to grapple, I think he could potentially look like a moderate to large size favorite here in this matchup. So I like Gabe Green. I think he probably covers the price tag here, but I do respect the early knockout upside of Lines, so I'm going to treat it that way on DraftKings. Next fight up, we have, and I don't even want to talk about it, last week, it was the fight that screwed basically everybody. Romanov was as high as 70-something% in higher stakes contests last week on DraftKings, and I believe 54% in the main contest on DraftKings. And of course, after lineups locked, a couple fights in the broadcast, we get the Brendan Fitzgerald breaking news: Chase Sherman, medical issue, pulled out of the fight. Those lineups are completely dead. So Twitter was obviously a dumpster fire. I don't even want to bring that up. But now the fight gets rebooked. All of a sudden, the medical issue was miraculously healed because they announced even the same night that this fight would be taking place next Saturday. So who knows what the issue was, or if there even was a real issue. But we got Alexander Romanov coming in as a big favorite, minus 2,200 favorite, and Chase Sherman on the comeback at plus 1,100. And this one, I talked about it last week in my article. I have the same write-up this week in my article. Don't have to spend a ton of time on it. Romanov is the best play on the slate. And I know there was kind of like, some people were talking about that on Twitter and stuff like, the Chalk Donkeys played Romanov. Like, yeah, of course we played Romanov. He literally was like a minus 250 favorite to win inside the first round. You do not get those type of odds really almost ever, and especially in this type of matchup where it's just so clear that he's going to take him down, he's going to smash him, he's almost always winning in the first round here. So you're basically paying for a floor of 90 points, and you just can't get that type of safety, that level of floor and upside combination pretty much on a week-to-week basis. You almost never get that sort of combination. So I'm pretty much always going to take that when I can get it. I locked Romanov in, I think, all but 3 lineups last week, so it obviously didn't work out great for me, but I'm going right back to the well here. You know, it was obviously a pretty fluke thing. I think Romanov takes him down early, wins by ground and pound or submission, probably submission, because that is his MO. Like, he's going to look for that front forearm choke. He's going to be fishing for submissions. But Sherman, you know, I could see him getting submitted. He just got subbed by Jake Collier, who's also fighting on this card. Ended up taking him down and submitting him in the first round back in January. Romanov, I think, is a much more dangerous grappler on the mat and just super powerful, right? Like, we saw him at weigh-ins, comes in looking super lean and mean. So I think Romanov smashes here. I don't think that's a hot take. And I think the minus 550 inside the distance line should probably tell you that you need to play this guy on DraftKings this week. Next fight up, we have Daniel De Silva coming in as a small favorite, minus 120 favorite. The comeback on Deiveson Figueiredo's brother, Francisco Figuereto, is plus 100. And if you guys have been following me for a while, I do not rate Francisco Figueiredo's skill set highly whatsoever. I think this guy is a major fraud, probably doesn't even belong at the UFC level. Like, I know he was able to beat Jerome Rivera, but let's be honest, that's not saying much. I think in this matchup, Daniel De Silva, I think he's at least going to bring in, you know, that Brandon Royval level of variance into a lot of his fights. Like, I don't think his skill set or his ceiling is super high, but I do think his finishing ability you can't ignore. Like, he's going to come at you super aggressive. He's got a very aggressive ground game. He's a slick submission grappler, holds a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he's going to look for it, right? Like, he has a bunch of crafty submissions on his record. The thing about De Silva is obviously the cardio. Like, he's never been to the third round. He's actually only been to the second round twice in his career. So the cardio is pretty much unproven, and we did see him fade in his debut against Jeff Molina. But Molina's, you know, a pretty good up-and-coming prospect here. Don't fault him too much for that. And against Francisco Figueiredo, who I honestly don't think has really much of anything to be concerned about. You know, Figueiredo's leaned on his wrestling through his 2 UFC fights here, and he can land a couple takedowns here and there, but I actually think he's in danger if he goes to his wrestling here against Daniel De Silva, who has multiple submission victories off of his back. I do think he's the better grappler here, and I just think he's the more, if there's going to be a finish in this fight, I think it more than likely comes on Daniel De Silva's side. But both guys have cardio issues. You know, I mentioned De Silva, the cardio is pretty much unproven. It's been proven on the Figueiredo side. It's been proven that he doesn't have good cardio. So I like the upside of De Silva here. I think this could be a fight where outside of the first round, maybe both guys start to tire. It gets super, super sloppy. And we know typically the lower level of competition, especially at the flyweight and the lower weight divisions, they tend to rack up points on DraftKings. I know maybe the volume starts to go a little bit, but you see a bunch of reversals, you see potential finishes, maybe a couple knockdowns. It just tends to get really sloppy, and we like that for DraftKings. But I like Daniel De Silva here. I'm going to be betting him in some way, shape, or form. I do think there's probably value on the money line, but I'm waiting for those props on FanDuel just because I think the submission is probably his most likely path to victory here, or maybe just target an under in this spot just because both guys gas tank issues. I mentioned De Silva, he likes to get you out of there really early. Figueiredo, prior to the UFC, was kind of in the same boat. So I think this one ends early. I think it's a good target either way on DraftKings, but I'm going to heavily lean on the upside of Daniel De Silva, who I think gets it done by submission this Saturday. And before we get to the main card, do me a favor, guys. If you're still watching, like the video and hit that subscribe button as I continue to bring you more MMA content each and every week for every UFC card. I definitely appreciate it, guys. It goes a long way, and it only takes 2 seconds. So hook your boy up and help me out. Next fight up in the middleweight division, we have Krzysztof Jocko comes in as a minus 165 favorite. The comeback on my guy Gerald Meerschaert is plus 145. And this one, I think, you know, I do have a small bet on Meerschaert. I bet half a unit on Meerschaert by submission at plus 460. And reason being is because, outside of the way these two match up, you give me plus 460 on Meerschaert by submission against pretty much anybody, I'm gonna consider it here. And I know Jocko is an okay grappler. It's tough to submit him. I get that. But plus 460, you're saying Meerschaert wins by submission less than 20% of the time. I just don't really see that happening here. I do think he can get the fight to the mat here. He averages 2.5 takedowns per 15 minutes. He's a guy who I just think is going to be the more active of the two, because Krzysztof Jocko, my big issue with him is that he pretty much never does anything. Like, he's a low volume striker, doesn't really have a ton of power, and then on top of that, like, he's not really mixing in his wrestling a ton. So it's like he's okay wherever the fight goes, but he's one of those guys that just lets his opponents dictate where the fight takes place. And in terms of Meerschaert, I mentioned the takedowns, the striking isn't great, he's super stiff, whatever, but I actually think he might be the more active of the two, so he could win minutes just on the basis of him just being more active, doing more in those striking exchanges, and then just distracting him enough before he takes the fight to the ground, whether that's pulling guard, landing a takedown, whatever. So I actually like the dog, Gerald Meerschaert here. I think he's a live underdog on DraftKings. I mentioned my bet, half a unit on Meerschaert by submission at plus 460. And by the way, that seems to be off market quite a bit. That's still available on FanDuel. I saw other books at like plus 300. So FanDuel has a plus 460. If you're going to bet him by sub, do it over there. And hopefully he comes through for us on Saturday. But he's going to be one of my my more popular underdogs this week on DraftKings, just because I think in a win, he's probably scoring really well. And I do think the submission is pretty likely here, or at least just get your hand raised, even in a decision. If he lands a couple takedowns or whatever, he's probably not going to crush it, but if no other underdogs come through at his price, that just might be enough. So I like Meerschaert here. I got Meerschaert by submission as the official pick of this one. Up next, we have Darren the Damage Elkins at minus 170, Tristan Connolly on the comeback at plus 150. And this is a matchup where I favor the Elkins side, which is always kind of scary to say, but I do think he's probably the better minute winner here. I think Connolly, more than likely, he probably needs to finish Elkins here to get his hand raised. That wouldn't shock me, because Connolly is, he is a tested veteran. He does have decent power. He's super low volume on the feet, though. And Darren Elkins, yes, he could be hurt, he could be wobbled, but it's still pretty tough to get him out of there. Like, even in the Cub Swanson one where he got knocked out in the first round, I think that stoppage was fine, but you saw, like, he's protesting the stoppage. He's ready to go to war, even if it means taking a couple punches where maybe his brain shuts off for a couple seconds. But I think if Elkins takes the path to victory here of just keeping the fight on the feet, being the more active of the two, because I do think he's going to be the one landing more on the feet. And then in terms of the grappling, Darren Elkins is clearly the more credentialed wrestler. We saw Pat Sabatini use that Division I wrestling background to basically blanket Tristan Connolly and neutralize him for a minimum of 2 of the first 3 rounds. Connolly did win the 3rd round off Sabatini, but that's when he was kind of in the driver's seat, just cruising. I think if Elkins just uses his wrestling base, be's the more active fighter on the feet, I think he could be fine here. I think Connolly probably needs to hurt him on the feet or pull off a sub, and Elkins is historically very difficult to submit. So I think Elkins is fine here. I'm not going to lay that type of chalk on Darren Elkins, but I do think he probably gets his hand raised here outside of a finish. So we're going with the Damage in this fight of the night. Next fight up, we have Grant Dawson, minus 180 favorite. The comeback on Jared Flash Gordon is plus 155. And I've always liked Grant Dawson. I rate him pretty highly in terms of a prospect. However, his last fight was a big red flag. His 2 fights ago was not a huge red flag, but we did see, like, in his last 2 fights now, he's been kind of exposed to a degree in that, if he can't get the fight to the ground for, with little resistance against his opponents, and if he has to work hard for those takedowns, the cardio may not hold up for 15 minutes. And against Leonardo Santos, and I believe there was a point deduction in that fight as well, but he was drawing dead to a finish there, and he did get the finish in the 3rd round, but he was drawing dead to a finish there, so it was like he barely got away with the victory. And then in his last fight, it ended up being a draw because he was able to go to those takedowns, the relentless takedowns early against Ricky Glenn, and then in round 3, he was completely gassed. Glenn stuffed the takedown early, and Glenn dominated him for that round. So Glenn was able to get a 10-8 in the 3rd, and that's why it ended up as a draw. So now we have basically back-to-back fights where Dawson You know, we know his striking is not that good. It is improving, but it's still pretty awkward. He does have some power in his hands, but his striking is still very awkward, and his striking defense is completely non-existent. And that's the red flag for me, because if you're going against somebody that actually has power and can counter you, you're probably going to get knocked out. And we've seen him eat some big shots in multiple fights. He's had a fight where he had a big giant goose egg on his orbital. He's had fights where he was rocked as well. So if this fight plays out on the feet, I do think he's probably at risk here. But I also just don't think Jared Gordon has that type of power, at least not at this stage in his career. Jared Gordon, more of a nutritional damage guy. But I do think the grappling dynamic is interesting here, because you know, Jared Gordon, it's no secret, he's got a solid wrestling base as well, averages over 2 takedowns per 15 minutes, and trains under Renzo Gracie, a credentialed grappler in that system. So I do think Dawson is probably going to have success in getting it to the mat, at least early in this fight, but I'm not convinced that he's going to be able to control Jared Gordon for extended periods. And then also Jared Gordon, I don't think he's going to be able to submit Jared Gordon. So I do think Dawson has success here. I still like Grant Dawson, but the way that I kind of see it playing out is Grant Dawson probably needs to put him on him with the ground and pound. And Jared Gordon, the concern with Gordon has always been his glass chin. He's been knocked out 4 times in his career. Those were all 4 of his professional losses. So I just think if you're going to give me plus 750, which FanDuel is right now, I'm going to take that. Even though Grant Dawson is historically not much of a knockout guy, I could see him ragdolling Jared Gordon early in the fight and eventually putting the ground and pound on him and maybe testing that chin. At plus 750, I think it's at least worth a small poke. So I bet half a unit Grant Dawson by TKO at plus 750, but I do think Jared Gordon has potential to be a live underdog here, because the biggest thing to me is like if that finish doesn't materialize and Dawson has to work for those early takedowns and he's really expending a lot of energy trying to control Jared Gordon, we have no question that he can go a hard 15 minutes. He's gonna have the better cardio in this matchup. So if he can steal one of the first 2 rounds, if this goes to round 3, I think he probably has more left in the tank, especially if Dawson has to work hard for those takedowns early in the fight. So it's just another spot where, and there's been quite a few on this card where I favor one side in Dawson, but I am respecting the path to victory of the Jared Gordon side. So I'm not like completely hedging too much here, but I am saying on multi-entry style of player, I'm going to have some exposure to Jared Gordon as well, but I do think Dawson gets his hand raised here. So Dawson by decision is the official pick. I hope it comes by knockout to cash that plus 750, but either way, hopefully he gets it done for us on DraftKings. And in our featured bout of the evening, we have Andre Touchy-Feely going up against Joe Anderson Burrito, another former Dana White Contender Series guy, which you know I love these type of cards. Just a quick plug, come this next season of Dana White Contender Series, which should be coming up pretty soon. I believe it's in June. Basically, I do a bunch of Dana White Contender Series breakdowns right here on my YouTube channel, so go ahead and check those out. You could see the ones from last season. A lot of cool features I'm going to be adding for this season of Dana White Contender Series. Have a lot of fun on that show, so I'm just going to plug that real quick. So whenever we get multiple Dana White Contender Series fighters on a card, I get really excited because I do extra work on these prospects, probably more than I should, but it tends to pay a little bit when they do come into the UFC, especially when we've seen so many times them get a little bit overvalued. So there is some potential value betting against them at times. I think this is probably one where I'm just going to stay away. I favor Andre Feely in this matchup, but he's coming in as a pretty big favorite here. Minus 260. The comeback on Burrito is plus 210. But I rate Feely probably higher than the market. I bet him in a couple spots where he won as an underdog, and I bet him in a couple spots where he didn't come through. So he's been kind of, it's been hit or miss, my relationship with Andre Feely, but I am still a fan. He's a technical kickboxer, looked great in his last fight against Daniel Pineda, was cruising in that first round, really putting it on him, and I thought maybe he could get an early finish and probably get him out of there. Pineda was really starting to fade away, and then obviously we had the accidental eye poke, but that prior to the eye poke, it ended up being a no contest, but prior to that was one of the best we've seen Andre Feely look inside the octagon, in my opinion. So I like Feely here. I think aside from the striking advantage, and I do think he will have the striking advantage, aside from the striking advantage, he can mix in the wrestling. He averages over 2.5 takedowns per 15 minutes, and that's probably going to be what Joe Anderson Burrito tries to do. You know, he's gone to his ground game in most of his fights. He was actually on a 10-fight win streak prior to making his UFC debut against Bill Algeo, and he ended up losing that fight, so it snapped a 10-fight win streak. But he's a guy that's just super explosive. His striking is not very technical, but he's just kind of a wild man, aggressive. He's going to come forward and wing some powerful shots. But Fili's historically very durable. I think he's just a level above in terms of the technicality. So the way I expect this striking to play out is Fili to have tight defense on the feet. I expect him to beat up the legs of Burrito, use that jab, use that length. He's got a much better jab than Burrito here. And then Burrito, also the cardio. You know, he tends to slow down as the fight goes on. Fili, we know, is going to be ready to go a hard 15 minutes if he needs to. So it's like, I think Burrito maybe could potentially land a takedown or two early in this fight, but I really would be surprised if he's able to blanket and control Andre Fili the way that Bryce Mitchell and others have been able to do in the past. So I favor Fili here. I think for the most part, I think he keeps it standing, and I think he touches up Joe Anderson Burrito. So I like Fili. Fili by decision is the official pick this week. Next fight up, we have our co-main event. Andre Arlovski going up against Jake Collier. Arlovski is a -140 favorite. Jake Collier, the slight underdog at +120. And this is one I'm not going to spend a ton of time on. I really have no interest betting this fight. I really don't even have interest on DraftKings either. I know they're priced affordably in the mid-range, but I just really don't see the upside really for either guy here. Arlovski, we know what he's going to do at this stage in his career. He's going to dance around the outside and play that technical boxing game, and that's fine. He's had a great run of success. He's on a 3-fight win streak. He's won, I believe, 4 of his I think it's 5 of his last 6. So it's really been a great run for Arlovski, who's now like 43 years old. But I just think I can never bet on this dude. And I don't know what it is about it. Like, I never even in those wins, like I don't think he's winning. Like, I don't score a lot of these fights for him. And then he ends up getting his hand raised by split decision. So he just has a way of, I guess, doing more in terms of the judges' eyes, because we know he's typically getting outlanded on those striking exchanges. And I do expect Collier, who is high volume for heavyweight, I do expect him to be the more active of the two, you know, using a lot of leg kicks, trying to slow down the movement of Arlovski. And I just think he's going to be landing a lot more. So this is one where it's going to be Collier landing a bunch of probably empty volume, Arlovski doing his usual song and dance, and then it just comes down to whoever the judges think did a little bit more. So I would lean Collier on just being the more active of the two, but it seems time and time again, Arlovski ends up getting his hand raised when I don't think he should. So I'm just going to stay away. I don't have a strong read on it. I favor Collier just because I think he's going to be the much more active of the two, but I wouldn't be surprised to see Arlovski get another split decision that I don't think he deserves. So in our co-main event, it's basically just a big pass for me all around. Which brings us to our main event, and this is a matchup that I'm actually really excited about. This is probably one of the fights that I've been most excited about in the past month or so. It's a nice segue into UFC 274 next week in Arizona, which is a banger card. So I'm super excited. I hope that we leave this Saturday on a high note with this fight leading up to the big pay-per-view next week. But in terms of this matchup, you know, Rob Font, we know what he's going to bring to the table. He's a high-volume striker. He lands like 5.74 significant strikes per minute. He's got one of the best jabs in the bantamweight division. He's one of the better boxers in the division. The only problem with him in this matchup is there at times, you know, he can be a little bit finish reliant, and I just don't think that's going to happen against Chito Vera, a guy who's historically very durable, has excellent cardio. I do give him the cardio. I do think the cardio dynamic plays to his favor, and this is the first time that we're going to see him potentially in a 5-round fight, and I do think that favors him clearly, just because I think he's got the much better gas tank of the two, and I think the durability, especially over 25 minutes, is a big factor. So Chito Vera, while he likes to start slow, I do think he's going to start putting it on Rob Font. Rob Font, I mentioned the high volume, but he pumps out that jab repeatedly. He headhunts a little bit too much. Chito Vera always, you know, notoriously has that high guard. I think he's going to limit most of the damage coming from Rob Rob Font, and if Font tries to mix in those takedowns, I think Vera's the better submission grappler. I think he's the more dangerous grappler of the two. I wouldn't put that past him, but I do think this goes the full 25 minutes, and I think just the cardio dynamic and the durability is enough to make me lean the Chito Vera side in what should be a competitive fight. I think it's going to be a banger, but I like the Chito Vera side. I favor him in this matchup ever so slightly, and because we're getting a little bit of plus money, I think it's worth a bet. So I played him for 1 unit at plus 114. He is my preferred side on DraftKings as well, just because I think especially rounds 3, rounds 4, round 5 is where we really see Chito start to turn up if the fight ends up lasting that long. So I like Chito Vera to get his hand raised in what should be a banger of a matchup in the bantamweight division. And as always, I have the written article where I go a little bit more in depth on my website at fightnumbers.com, where I also post DraftKings fighter rankings broken down by salary tier. I do ownership projections for DraftKings as well, some other tools and information for bettors and DFS players. Go check it out. It's all completely free at fightnumbers.com. And as always, I'll be having the underdog MMA prop picks for this weekend's card up on my YouTube channel no later than Thursday evening, so check that out as well. Do me a favor, guys, like this video, drop a comment, let me know what your favorite bet is for this week's card. Good luck, and we'll see you next time.